The city exhaled a breath of ice, a bitter wind that snaked through alleyways and bit at exposed skin. For Sophia, it was more than cold. It was a constant, gnawing predator. 8 months pregnant, her body was a paradox of life and exhaustion, a fragile vessel against the concrete wilderness. Her worn-out jacket, a relic from a life that no longer existed, offered little more than a memory of warmth. She sat on the frozen steps of a forgotten building, her fingers, stiff and blue, fumbling with colored threads. Each bracelet she wove was a prayer, a desperate plea for a hot meal, for a single night in a room with a door that locked. The city roared around her, a symphony of indifference, but the only sound she truly heard was the steady, hopeful beat of the heart inside her. She was a ghost, haunted by the sound of slamming doors. First, the door of the man who had promised her forever, until the word father became a weight he refused to carry. Then the door of her childhood home, shut by the hands of a family that chose shame over love. Their final words, disgrace, echoed in the hollows of her hunger. Now, every face that passed was a potential door, and she saw them all closing before she could even raise her hand to knock. People saw a pregnant girl on the street and saw a mistake, a burden, a problem to be ignored. They didn't see the woman who hummed lullabies to her belly in the dark, who used her own body as a shield against the wind, promising a world she wasn't sure she could deliver. Hunger was a cruel artist, painting dizzying spots before her eyes. The scent of roasted nuts from a street vendor's cart was a form of exquisite torture, a luxury as distant as the moon. Every coin dropped into her small, upturned box felt like a miracle, but miracles were scarce. She watched families walk by, wrapped in thick coats and laughter, their children clutching warm drinks. They moved in a bubble of light and safety that felt like another dimension. For them, she was part of the scenery, a sad statue of urban decay. Sophia learned to lower her gaze, to make her pleas silent, because the pity in some eyes hurt more than the scorn in others. She was invisible, yet her swollen belly made her a spectacle of failure for all to judge. Her hands would instinctively cup her stomach, a protective gesture that was as natural as breathing. In the deep, lonely hours of the night, when the city lights blurred into a cold smear, she would whisper to the life within her. It was a secret conversation, a sacred pact between a mother and her unborn child. She told him stories of a warm bed and a sky full of stars, not the sliver of polluted sky she could see between skyscrapers. She promised him safety, a promise that felt like a lie on her chattering teeth. But it was the only thing she truly owned, her word. This silent vow was her armor. It was the reason she got up each morning from her bed of cardboard, the reason she faced the relentless tide of judging eyes. She was not just surviving for herself. A sudden downpour began, the rain not cleansing but chilling, turning the city into a grey, weeping maze. Sophia scrambled for the meager shelter of a storefront awning, but the owner quickly emerged, his face a mask of irritation. "Not here," he snapped, shooing her away with a flick of his wrist as if she were a stray animal. "You're bad for business." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A passing couple averted their eyes, pulling their child closer. In that moment of public rejection, drenched and trembling, Sophia felt the last embers of her hope flicker. But then, a tiny, determined kick from within reminded her why she couldn't let them go out. She straightened her back, the rain plastering her hair to her face, and her expression settled into one of quiet, unbreakable defiance. The world could strip her of everything, but it could not take her dignity. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was a thief, stealing the feeling from her fingers and the hope from her heart. Hours had passed, and the small box at her feet remained unforgivingly empty. Each passing car was a blur of warmth and comfort she could not touch. Desperation, a familiar and bitter taste, rose in her throat. Her gaze fell upon the glass and steel titan across the street, Caldwell Tower. It was a fortress of wealth, a place she knew would spit her out, but the wind was a blade, and the awning at its entrance offered a cruel sliver of shelter. It wasn't a plan born of logic, but of pure animal instinct. She had to move, or the cold would claim her and the promise she carried inside. With a resolve that surprised even herself, Sophia pushed to her feet, her body a heavy burden. Each step across the bustling street was a battle against the wind and the stares of strangers. To them, she was a spectre of poverty, drifting toward a sanctuary she had no right to enter. A woman in a fur coat clutched her purse tighter. A businessman altered his path to avoid her. They saw a threat, a problem, a disruption to their orderly world. They didn't see a mother fighting a war with nothing but the love for her unborn child as a weapon. She kept her eyes fixed on the building's entrance, a distant shore in a storm, ignoring the silent waves of judgment that crashed against her. Just as she reached the curb, the skyscraper's revolving doors spun open, releasing a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his face a mask of cold authority. This was Damien Caldwell, a man who built empires from concrete and ambition, yet whose own heart was a ruin. He moved with an unnerving stillness, his gaze fixed on the gleaming black car waiting for him, a chariot to whisk him away from the city's grit. He was surrounded by an invisible shield of power and importance, a man so high up he no longer saw the people on the ground. For him, the world was a chessboard, and he was always the king. The moment Sophia stepped into the orbit of his presence, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The uniformed doorman, who had been a statue of polite indifference, suddenly stiffened, his eyes narrowing into slits of disapproval. A security guard near the entrance subtly shifted his weight, his hand moving instinctively closer to his belt. They were the gatekeepers of this world, trained to identify and neutralize anything that didn't belong. Sophia was a glaring anomaly, a smudge of desperation on a pristine canvas of wealth. Her worn jacket and swollen belly were an indictment of the system they were paid to protect. Their silent condemnation was a physical force pressing down on her, trying to make her turn back. Ignoring them, her focus narrowed to the luxury car, its polished surface reflecting the grey, unforgiving sky. It wasn't the car she cared about. It was the momentary shield it offered. She reached the vehicle just as the driver opened the rear door for Damien. For a fleeting second, she leaned her exhausted body against the cold, smooth metal of the passenger side door. It was a small, desperate act to escape a gust of wind that felt like 1,000 needles. From the outside, it looked like an invasion, a brazen act of a street person touching something sacred, something untouchable. It was an intrusion into a world that had posted no trespassing signs all over her life. Damien saw the movement from the corner of his eye. He didn't look at her face. He didn't need to. He had seen it 1,000 times before. In his mind, she was just another problem to be managed, another piece of urban decay cluttering his view. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to his driver, a silent order to hurry, to close the door, to erase her from his reality. He felt a familiar wave of contempt, the cold certainty that all these people wanted was a handout, a shortcut. He saw weakness, not struggle. He saw a nuisance, not a human being fighting for her life. His world was built on strength, and he had no room for her brand of desperation. But just as the heavy door began to swing shut, sealing him inside his sterile bubble, her voice, a fragile whisper, slipped through the closing gap. It wasn't a plea for money, it wasn't a cry for help, it was a secret, spoken only to the life she carried. With one hand pressed tenderly against her stomach, she murmured words that were never meant for his ears. "Don't be afraid, my love," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "I promise you'll be born somewhere warm. Mommy isn't giving up. Never." It was a sacred vow made in the heart of a storm, a promise of a world she had no means to build, spoken with the conviction of a queen. The sound of that promise, so pure and so powerful, hung in the air inside the silent car. The world outside continued its harsh judgment. The doorman began to take a step toward her, his face a mask of stern resolve, ready to remove the unwelcome presence. The driver, oblivious, prepared to pull away from the curb, leaving her behind in the biting cold. For everyone watching, the scene was simple. A homeless woman had overstepped her bounds and was about to be dealt with. They saw an act of defiance that had failed. They had no idea they had just witnessed a prayer that had the power to shatter a millionaire's soul. The man who emerged from the gleaming glass doors of Caldwell Tower was not a man at all. He was an institution. Damien Caldwell moved with the cold, deliberate precision of the buildings he erected. His thoughts a blueprint of profit margins and strategic acquisitions. The city outside was merely a landscape he owned. its people distant figures in a life he observed but never touched. His dark, tailored suit was armor, and his face was a fortress, guarding a hollow kingdom where grief had long ago been declared king. He saw the world through a lens of calculated risk and emotional detachment, a survival mechanism he had perfected 5 years ago when his own world had crumbled to dust, leaving him the sole, silent ruler of its ruins. As he strode toward the curb, his world's machinery hummed around him. The doorman, a statue of polished brass buttons and practiced deference, bowed his head just so. His driver, already holding the door of the black sedan open, was a seamless extension of his will. These were the constants, the predictable pieces in the orderly game of his life. He didn't see them as people. He saw them as functions. The icy wind that whipped down the concrete canyon was an annoyance, an imperfection in his climate-controlled existence. He craved the silent, sterile sanctuary of his car, a place where he could once again be sealed off from the messy, unpredictable chaos of humanity that teemed just beyond the tinted glass. And then, she was there, a smudge of grey against the flawless black of his car, Sophia. Her presence was a discordant note in his carefully composed symphony of power. The sight of her worn jacket and exhausted frame leaning against the vehicle sent a jolt of pure irritation through him. It was an intrusion, a violation of the unspoken boundary that separated his world from hers. The doorman's posture immediately stiffened, shifting from servile to sentinel. The driver's hand paused, awaiting a command. In that frozen moment, two universes collided with a silent, violent force, the universe of warmth promised to an unborn child, and the universe of a man who believed warmth was a lie. His mind, a ruthless engine of categorization, processed her instantly. Vagrant, nuisance, a problem to be swiftly removed. He felt the familiar, bitter taste of contempt rise in his throat, a disdain for the perceived weakness and lack of control that led a person to this state. He had built his empire on the principle of merciless self-reliance. He had no currency for pity. With a barely perceptible flick of his eyes, he signaled his driver to close the door, to complete the transaction of his departure, to erase this blemish from his reality. He had already turned his mind away from her, moving on to the evening's agenda, consigning her to the vast, anonymous category of things he did not have to care about. The world around them agreed with his silent verdict. A woman walking a small dog pulled her pet closer, her face a mask of distaste. The doorman took a purposeful step forward, his expression hardening into one of righteous authority, ready to restore order. To every observer, the scene was a simple, brutal equation, privilege asserting its right to remain undisturbed. They saw a desperate woman overstepping her bounds, an act of social contamination that needed to be cleansed. They saw a public space being reclaimed for its rightful owner. Their collective judgment was a cold, invisible wall, pressing in on Sophia, confirming her invisibility, validating the millionaire's impulse to simply drive away and forget. But as the heavy car door began its final arc, a sound slipped through the closing gap. A sound so fragile it should have been devoured by the city's roar. It was a whisper, not meant for him, not meant for anyone but the life stirring within her. The words were not a plea for money or a cry for help. They were a vow, a sacred oath sworn against the cold concrete. "Don't be afraid, my love," she murmured, her hand a fierce, protective shield over her belly. "I promise you'll be born somewhere warm." The words were an act of creation, a mother building a sanctuary out of nothing but her own voice, a defiant whisper against the storm. The final part of her promise struck him with the force of a physical blow. Mommy isn't giving up. Never. The word never hung in the silent, leather-scented air of the car, a ghost from his own past. He was instantly transported back 5 years to a sterile hospital room, to the feel of his wife's cold hand in his. He remembered the promise he had whispered to her, her desperate, useless assurance that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't give up. A promise he had broken, a promise he had fled. Sophia's words didn't just break the silence. They shattered the 5 years of ice he had carefully constructed around his heart, exposing the raw, unhealed wound beneath. The world outside held its breath. Damien's hand, which had been reaching for his briefcase, was frozen in mid-air. The driver looked into the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed in confusion at the sudden, unnerving stillness of the man in the back seat. The doorman halted, his mission to eject the woman suspended by his employer's inexplicable paralysis. The chasm between the millionaire in his fortress of wealth and the pregnant woman on the street was suddenly gone. In its place was a fragile, shimmering bridge, built from the echo of a broken promise and the power of one that refused to be broken. The encounter was no longer improbable. It was inevitable. The single word cut through the city's noise, sharp and cold as shattered glass. Stop! It was not a request. It was a command that froze the world. The driver's hand recoiled from the gear shift. The doorman, mid-stride, halted as if he'd walked into an invisible wall. Damien Caldwell pushed the heavy car door open and stepped back out into the biting wind, his movements stiff, unnatural. He did not look at Sophia, not at first. He looked at the grey, unforgiving sky, as if searching for an answer to a question he didn't know he was asking. His entire life was a fortress of control, and a whisper from a stranger had just breached its walls, leaving him exposed and disarmed on the hostile pavement. Sophia flinched, instinctively taking a step back. Years of life on the streets had taught her that a rich man's attention was a dangerous thing. It meant one of two outcomes, humiliation or removal. She braced for the torrent of abuse, for the security guards who would materialize to drag her away. When he finally turned his gaze on her, she saw not anger, but a raw, unnerving confusion that was somehow more frightening. His eyes, which she had assumed would be cold and empty, were a storm of something she couldn't name. He was a predator who had suddenly forgotten how to hunt, and his silence was a threat she couldn't measure. Her hand tightened over her belly, her only shield against him. The doorman, recovering his composure, moved to intervene. His voice a low, deferential murmur meant only for his employer. "Sir, allow me. I will have her removed from the premises immediately." He saw a simple problem that required a simple solution, a piece of trash to be swept from the pristine entrance of the tower. His words, though spoken with professional calm, dripped with condescension. He was erasing her, dismissing her as a non-entity, a task on a checklist. This casual dehumanization was a familiar pain, but seeing it happen in front of the man whose gaze was still locked on her felt like a fresh wound, a public branding of her worthlessness for all to see. Damien ignored his employee, his mind a battlefield. Every rational instinct screamed at him to get back in the car, to drive away, to forget the woman and her impossible promise. This was not his problem. It was an emotional entanglement, the very thing he had spent 5 years meticulously avoiding. He reached into his coat, his hand closing around a thick money clip. It was his default solution, the universal solvent for all of life's messy complications. He pulled out a wad of bills, enough to rent a room for months, and thrust it toward her. It was not an act of charity. It was a transaction, a payment to make her, and the ghost she had awakened in him, disappear. Sophia looked at the money in his hand, then back at his face. For a fleeting moment, the exhaustion in her features was replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated fire. She didn't recoil in shame. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze with a strength that seemed to defy her circumstances. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of a bell. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of independence that he could not comprehend. She was rejecting the only language he knew how to speak. In that moment, she was not a beggar. She was a queen in rags, and her dignity was a crown he could not buy. Their standoff had become a spectacle. Pedestrians slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the bizarre tableau, the titan of industry and the pregnant girl on the curb. Whispers began to circulate, a low hum of judgment and speculation. They were a living embodiment of the city's brutal divide, a drama playing out for a fleeting audience. Damien felt the stares like physical blows. He hated being seen, truly seen, stripped of his corporate armor. The vulnerability was suffocating. He was accustomed to being observed with awe or fear, not with this naked, intrusive curiosity. The encounter was no longer a private crisis. It was a public indictment of his carefully curated isolation. Frustration and a strange, unfamiliar desperation warred within him. His usual tools, power, money, intimidation, were useless against her quiet refusal. He had to find another way, a language she would understand. His voice, when he spoke again, was harsh, stripped of all pretense. "Listen to me," he said, his tone clipped and brutal. "I don't care about your pride. I heard what you said to... in there." He gestured awkwardly toward her belly. "That promise you made. The wind is getting stronger. You're not going to keep it standing on this corner." He was using the truth as a weapon, aiming it directly at the one thing he knew she would die to protect, her child. Just as his words landed, a uniformed security guard emerged from the tower, his expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Is everything all right, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked, his presence shifting the dynamic immediately. He was the system made manifest, the authority that could, and would, remove Sophia by force. The threat was no longer implied. It was standing right there, a man in a uniform ready to enforce the unwritten laws of class and space. For Sophia, the world was shrinking, the walls closing in. She saw the end of the confrontation, her car being led away, her brief stand for dignity ending in the same old story of defeat. Sophia's gaze darted from the impassive guard to Damien's face, searching for a sign, an answer. She saw the conflict still raging in his eyes, a man fighting a war against himself. Then a tiny, insistent flutter from within her belly served as a powerful reminder. It was the promise. "I promise you'll be born somewhere warm." The words echoed in her soul, a sacred vow she could not break. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when another life depended on her. Taking a shaky breath, she gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of gratitude or surrender. It was a strategic choice, an act of a mother doing what she must for her child. The ride in the black sedan was a study in suffocating silence. Sophia sat pressed against the passenger door, as if trying to merge with the cold glass, creating as much physical distance as the luxurious space would allow. The scent of rich leather and expensive cologne was alien, invasive. Damien stared out his own window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of meaningless color. He had won the confrontation, but he felt no victory. He had a problem in his car he didn't know how to solve, a ghost from his past in his head, and a profound, unsettling feeling that in trying to control the situation, he had lost control of himself completely. The penthouse was a silent, sterile kingdom in the sky, a place so clean it felt like no one had ever truly lived in it. Damien led her through the vast, open space with the detached air of a museum curator. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the glittering city below like a collection of captured stars, a world Sophia had only ever seen from the cold ground up. Each piece of minimalist furniture, each piece of abstract art, screamed of a wealth so immense it was suffocating. He showed her to a guest suite that was larger than any apartment she had ever been in. He didn't offer her food or a kind word. He offered her a room, a temporary solution to a problem he desperately wanted to disappear. His voice was clipped, devoid of warmth as he laid out the terms of his transaction. "My assistant will contact a realtor in the morning," he stated, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the city lights, as if she were merely an inconvenient reflection in the glass. "She will secure a suitable apartment for you. A stipend will be arranged to cover your expenses until after the child is born." He spoke of her future as if it were a line item on a budget report, a problem to be solved with money and logistics. The offer was generous, a lifeline she couldn't refuse, but it was delivered with the cold charity of a man paying to have a stain removed from his pristine life. Sophia did not grovel. She did not weep with gratitude. She simply stood in the middle of the cavernous room, a small, fragile island in an ocean of wealth, and absorbed his words. Her silence was a force he hadn't anticipated. He expected tears or a desperate thank you, something to confirm his power and her helplessness. Instead, she gave a slight, weary nod, her hand never leaving the protective curve of her belly. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. She then moved to a simple, unadorned chair in the corner and sat down, her posture communicating not defiance, but a profound, unshakable dignity that felt utterly out of place amidst his calculated luxury. Her quiet strength was a mirror, and he hated what he saw in it. His irritation grew, fueled by her refusal to play the part he had assigned her. His gaze fell upon the small, grimy pouch she clutched in her lap, as if it were her only worldly possession. "What is that?" he demanded, the question sharper than he intended. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to understand the one variable in the room he couldn't quantify. With slow, deliberate movements, Sophia loosened the drawstring, She didn't reveal a handful of coins or a stolen trinket. Instead, she poured a cascade of color into her palm, dozens of small hand-woven bracelets, each one a testament to hours of patient work, a tiny rebellion of beauty created in the heart of despair. She held one up, a simple braid of blue and white thread. The sight of it was a physical shock, a lightning strike to his soul. The colors, they were the exact shades he and his wife, Clara, had chosen for the nursery. He was instantly thrown back 5 years, standing in a sun-drenched room, the smell of fresh paint in the air. He saw Clara's radiant smile as she held up a tiny, knitted blanket in the same soft blue and white. "For our little boy," she had whispered, her eyes shining with a future that would never come to be. The memory, so long buried under layers of ice and bitterness, ripped through him, leaving him breathless and exposed in the sterile silence of his penthouse. As if sensing the shift in the air but not its cause, Sophia felt compelled to explain, to prove she was more than the sum of her misfortunes. Her voice was a fragile murmur, filled with a mother's quiet hope. "I was making this one for him," she said, her gaze soft as she looked down at her belly. "I call him Noah. It's a silly thing, I guess, since I don't know if it's a boy. But the name means comfort. I wanted him to have something warm to hold on to. Something made by my own hands." The name Noah fell into the silent room and shattered the world around Damien. It was the name they had chosen, the name carved on a tiny headstone he could never bring himself to visit. It was too much. The bracelet, the colors, the name. It was a coordinated assault from a universe he believed was indifferent. The fortress he had spent 5 years building around his heart did not just crack. It disintegrated into dust. The pain was no longer a dull ache but a raw, gaping wound. He staggered backward, his hand flying out to grip the edge of a marble countertop, the cold stone the only thing keeping him upright. A strangled sound escaped his throat, a guttural mix of a sob and a gasp. The ruthless magnate, the man who moved markets with a single word, was gone. In his place stood a husband still grieving, a father who never was, drowning in the crushing weight of his own failure. Sophia watched his sudden, violent collapse, and in an instant, the fear and resentment she felt toward him vanished, replaced by a wave of pure, unbidden empathy. She did not know the specifics of his pain, but she recognized its brutal architecture. It was the landscape of loss, a territory she knew all too well. Forgetting her own exhaustion, forgetting the chasm of wealth that separated them, she rose slowly from her chair. She approached him not as a beggar to a king, but as one wounded soul to another. She said nothing. Words were useless here. Instead, she took the small blue and white bracelet and gently placed it on the counter beside his trembling hand. It was a gesture of shared humanity. That simple, silent offering of comfort broke the dam. The story poured out of him in a torrent of choked, fragmented sentences. The business trip he couldn't reschedule, the missed calls from a frantic nurse, the cold, sterile silence of the hospital room where he arrived too late. "I wasn't there," he confessed, the words torn from his soul. "I was closing a deal while my world was ending. I promised her I would be there for him, for both of them, and I failed." He was no longer speaking to Sophia. He was confessing to the ghosts that haunted the empty rooms of his life, finally giving voice to the guilt that had been his only companion for 5 agonizing years. Sophia listened, her own sorrow a quiet echo of his. She saw past the expensive suit and the cold demeanor to the broken man beneath. He was not her enemy. He was a fellow survivor of a shipwreck, clinging to the wreckage of a life that could have been. When he finally fell silent, the air in the room had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by the fragile stillness that follows a storm. He slowly raised his head and looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not a problem to be managed, but a woman who, with nothing but her own 2 hands and a fierce heart, was fighting to keep the very promise he had broken. In her he saw the strength he had lost, and the unconditional love he had believed was gone from the world forever. If this story moved you, please like and share. So many people are fighting silent battles just like this one. The raw silence that followed his confession was heavier than any word could be. Damien finally looked up from the floor, his eyes stripped of their usual armor, and truly saw her. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but also the fierce, unbreakable light within them. He saw the hand that never strayed from her belly, a gesture of protection so primal and powerful it shamed his years of calculated detachment. The small woven bracelet on the marble counter was no longer just a trinket. It was a testament, a symbol of a promise he had failed to keep, and one she refused to break. In that moment, pity was an insult. What he felt was a profound, shattering awe. He knew then that he couldn't just give her money. He had to honor her fight. He had to help her build the warm place she had sworn to create. His voice, when he finally spoke, was unrecognizable. The cold, clipped authority was gone, replaced by a quiet, raw humanity that trembled with the effort of its own rebirth. "This is not a handout," he began, his gaze steady, meeting hers without flinching. "What you have, that strength, it's a rare commodity." He outlined a plan not of charity, but of structure. He owned a secure, quiet apartment building a few blocks away. A 2-bedroom unit would be hers, fully furnished by morning. He would arrange for the best obstetrician in the city to manage her care, and when she was ready, there was a position waiting for her at his charitable foundation. "I'm not giving you a life," he finished, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm giving you the tools to build the one you and your son deserve." Sophia listened, her body still, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She had learned that kindness from the rich often came with invisible chains, a price paid in pride and obligation. She searched his face, looking for the familiar glint of condescension or the self-satisfaction of a man playing God, but she found none. She saw only a landscape of profound sorrow, a man trying to mend his own shattered soul by helping to protect hers. Her answer was not a flood of grateful tears. It was a single, solemn nod, an act of profound dignity. "For him," she whispered, her hand tightening over her belly. "For Noah, I accept." With those words, she wasn't accepting a gift. She was claiming a weapon for her son's future, honoring her vow with a strength he had recognized. The change was immediate and tangible. Damien picked up his phone, but he didn't call a faceless assistant to manage the problem. He called his personal housekeeper, an older, kind-faced woman named Eleanor, and spoke to her with a gentleness that was startling. He asked her to come to the penthouse immediately, to prepare a warm meal and make the guest suite comfortable. When Eleanor arrived, she looked at Sophia not with suspicion, but with a simple and maternal warmth that melted a knot of fear Sophia hadn't even realized she was carrying. The feeling of a soft blanket being draped over her shoulders and the taste of hot, nourishing soup was a more powerful reward than any legal document. It was the first true moment of peace, the first brick in the foundation of that promised warm place. Later that night, the penthouse was quiet. Sophia was asleep in a real bed for the first time in months, one hand resting on her belly, a silent guardian even in her dreams. Damien stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights a blur below. In his hand, he held the small blue and white bracelet, its simple threads a lifeline back to a part of himself he thought was dead. He wasn't healed, but the ice around his heart had begun to thaw. He was no longer just the man who had lost a family. He was now the man helping to save one. A fragile, unspoken connection had been forged in the crucible of their shared pain, a partnership born not of romance, but of redemption. Justice was beginning, not with a gavel, but with a quiet act of grace. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear your story. 6 months later, the city was the same, but Sophia's world had been remade. The biting wind was now just a sound she heard from behind the warm, secure windows of her own apartment. The space, once a stranger's charity, was now a home, filled with the soft scent of baby powder and the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed. Little Noah, her son, slept peacefully in his crib, a tiny, perfect testament to a promise kept. She was no longer the ghost on the street corner. At Damien's foundation, she was a leader, her voice now a source of comfort for other women walking the same broken path she had. The bracelets she once wove for survival now hung as decorations, colorful symbols of a past she had not erased, but honored as the foundation of her unshakable strength. Damien Caldwell was a man unburdened. The fortress of his penthouse remained, but he no longer lived within its walls. He simply occupied the space. The real living was done elsewhere. He spent his afternoons at the foundation, not as a distant benefactor, but as a quiet presence. He learned the names of the children in the shelter, listened to the stories of the women Sophia helped, and found a purpose that had no place on a balance sheet. The cold, calculated mask he had worn for 5 years had fallen away, revealing the man beneath, a man still marked by grief but no longer defined by it. He found that in giving Sophia the tools to build her world, he had inadvertently been handed the blueprints to rebuild his own. One quiet evening, as Noah slept in his bassinet between them, the silence was not one of tension but of profound understanding. Sophia looked at the small, perfect bracelet on her son's wrist, a miniature version of the one that had changed everything. "I used to think his life started from nothing," she said softly, her voice clear and steady. "But I was wrong. It started from a promise." Damien watched her, the love radiating from her a force of nature. "I made a promise once, too," he confessed, his voice no longer choked with guilt, but filled with a quiet sorrow. "I broke it. But seeing you, seeing him, it feels like you kept it for me." Their shared pain was no longer a wound, but a sacred ground on which their strange, beautiful family was built. A week later, Damien did the one thing he had sworn he would never do. He drove Sophia and Noah to a quiet, sun-dappled cemetery just outside the city. He walked them to a simple, elegant headstone bearing 2 names, Clara and Noah Caldwell. He knelt, not with the crushing weight of failure, but with the gentle reverence of a man at peace. From his pocket, he pulled the small, faded blue and white bracelet Sophia had given him that first night. He gently laid it on the cool stone, a bridge between the family he had lost and the one he had found. It was not an act of replacement, but of inclusion. He was finally introducing his worlds, letting love, past and present, exist in the same sacred space. As he stood, Sophia placed a gentle hand on his arm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of solidarity. She understood. She knew the language of loss and the grammar of survival. In her eyes, he saw not a reflection of his own pain, but a vision of his redemption. He looked from her face to the sleeping baby in her arms, and a profound sense of gratitude washed over him, cleansing the last remnants of his bitterness. He had opened a door for a desperate stranger to shield her from the cold, and in doing so, she had walked straight into the frozen, abandoned rooms of his heart and filled them with light and warmth. He had offered her a key, and she had unlocked him. Later, standing at her apartment door after a quiet dinner, the air was filled with a sense of peaceful finality. Sophia, holding Noah, smiled a genuine, radiant smile. In her free hand, she held up the keys to her apartment, a silent acknowledgement of the world she had built. Damien simply nodded, his own small smile a mirror of her peace. He turned and walked down the hallway, his shoulders no longer stooped by the weight of the past. He was a man walking toward a future. She was a mother who had fought the world and won. She hadn't needed a hero to save her. She had needed a witness to her strength, and in seeing her, he had finally learned how to see himself again. If this story gave you hope, subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to believe in new beginnings.